Going all the way back to his presidential runs in the 1980s, Joe Biden has at times had a bit of trouble telling the truth about who he is and what he has done. And in no area is this as clear as when he's talked about the civil rights movement and what involvement, if any, he had in it. Joining us now to break it down after doing some amazing research in this area, Sean King, activist, journalist, and founder and CEO of the North Star. Sean, welcome to the Damage Report.
Yo, good to see you, man.
Good to have you here, especially after you put together an exhaustive analysis of Joe Biden's comments about the civil rights movement and the truth there. It's 2 truths and 31 lies. We can't cover them all, but give us an idea of what led you on this path to do this research and some of what you found.
Man, it was actually happenstance that I even learned that he was telling these lies about participating in the civil rights movement. He started mentioning in December of last year that he had marched in the civil rights movement, that he had organized in the civil rights movement, and I had never heard that before. And I didn't know, here's the thing, because there was no social media in the 1980s, the 90s, and there was hardly even social media in the 2000s when he ran for president against President Obama. Like the tools that we would have had to understand that he had been telling these lies in the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, and the 2000s. I just didn't know that history. And what most of the people who are watching us right now really didn't understand is that when Joe Biden ran for president in 1987 and 88, that his campaign really crashed and burned, not just because he was lying about the civil rights movement, but he got caught telling almost 20 different lies. He had lied about having a scholarship at law school. He had plagiarized 4 different speeches. He had lied about his standing in several different organizations, and ultimately kind of had to come forward and fall on his sword and say, I admit all of these mistakes. And at that point, he was not just trying to salvage his presidential campaign. He bowed out of that campaign. He was trying to salvage his political career. And one of the things that he came forward and said, and this is in 1987, is I never marched in the civil rights movement. I was not an organizer. I was not an activist. And this is a quote. He said, I was a suburbanite kid and I didn't go to Selma. He had kind of lied and said he had gone to Selma and Montgomery. He had lied and said he had seen Bull Connor with his own eyes. He said, I didn't go to Selma. I didn't go to Montgomery. He said, I didn't go anywhere. And when I say, there are 2 truths, that was his moment of truth. And here's the thing, Joe Biden actually has good, real, honest stories to tell about his life, but he seems to always want to add details to his biography that just aren't true. And from 1987 all the way into 2014, he never told those lies about participating in the civil rights movement again. I went back and I studied every speech he gave, every speech President Obama gave, from the Democratic conventions to when he was first chosen as VP, even to when President Obama gave him the Presidential Medal of Freedom. And you'll notice they never mention him participating in the civil rights movement. Well, at a random breakfast in 2014, Joe Biden starts telling this story again, that he marched in the civil rights movement, that he registered voters in the civil rights movement, that he participated in sit-ins at restaurants and movie theaters. And then all the way until last year, for 5 years, he never told those lies again. And last year, when he was campaigning in Iowa, into this year, when he's campaigning in Iowa and South Carolina, he starts telling these stories again, man. And it just sent me down a weird rabbit hole of beginning to understand that he has basically created a whole false narrative that he sells as if it's true, but he's already acknowledged that it's not true. The only other true statement he's ever made was that one when he stepped down from his 87 campaign, when he said, I lied, I was never a part of the civil rights movement. In his autobiography, which I read from cover to cover, here's the thing, John, it was actually a good book. Like I actually enjoyed it and enjoyed his actual stories. He only has 2 sentences in his entire autobiography. It's a 400-page book about the civil rights movement. He has 2 sentences. And he says, everything I learned about the civil rights movement, I learned from watching television and listening to the radio.
Yeah.
That's all he ever says. And that was his moment of honesty, man. And here's the thing, I just wrote a book that comes out in April. And my book went through a brutal fact-checking process. And Biden, I'm sure his book did too. He knew he couldn't put those lies in his book. So he said, everything I learned about the civil rights movement, I learned from watching television and listening to the radio. But here he is again, 40 years after he first starts telling these lies, lying again in Iowa. And he's literally going to Black churches all over South Carolina and saying a story that he's never told before, and it's a complete fabrication, that when he was a teenage boy, when he was a senior in high school, he would leave Catholic Mass and then go to different Black churches for training, where they would then go out and do marches and protests and demonstrations.
Yeah.
John, I spoke to people at those churches. Joe Biden never visited those churches, and he completely made this stuff up, man. I had somebody from South Carolina who loves Joe Biden tell me what disturbed them was, if he is knowingly telling these fabrications, it says something about his integrity. Mm-hmm. Or if he actually thinks they're true when they're not, it says something about his mental capacity. And I don't, I think it's more about his honesty. I think he's had a lifelong problem telling the truth.
Yeah.
And it's why, if you see his speeches here over the past couple of weeks, his campaign has put him on a teleprompter. He's now passing out pamphlets to people when they ask him questions instead of actually answering them. So I just think he has a struggle telling the truth about this area of his life.
Thanks for watching The Damage Report. What if you could protect yourself on the internet for the price of a cup of coffee a month? Well, if you head to nordvpn.com/TYT, you'll be able to connect up to 6 devices to NordVPN's military-grade encryption for $349 a month. If you go now, they'll even throw in a month for free. Go now.